The Indian farmers' protests. Now, that might be the movement's official name, but it almost undersells the situation. The protests may have started off with angry farmers, but it's escalated significantly since then, becoming one of the biggest movements in global history. This is beyond the point of disgruntled farmers. This is something a bunch of experts genuinely think could change the dynamics of the entire country. So in this video, let's take a look at where this all started, what got the farmers so angry. Then let's see how it's escalated, how we ended up with one of the largest protest movements in history, and why this could really shake the Indian government to its core. We're discussing this topic today because it was suggested by a whole bunch of people in the comments, but if you want to direct our content and support our channel, your best route is through Patreon. Over there, backers get the ability to vote on video topics, get early access to videos, exclusive live events. Oh, and this month, every backer over $10 gets an exclusive golden pin badge for free. They'll never be for sale, so make sure that you sign up this February to get yours. The link is in the description. This story actually starts last year in September, when the BJP, Prime Minister Modi's party, pushed 3 major agricultural laws through Parliament. Now, we don't have time in this video to run through the details of the laws, but together they kickstart the process of deregulating India's agricultural industry. This might not sound all that controversial, but the plans and the laws are set to hit small farmers particularly hard, the exact people who are taking to the streets right now. About 60% of Indians work in agriculture, meaning that a lot of people have a stake in this dispute. In fact, so dominant are all of these small farmers that 86% of India's farmland is controlled by farmers who own less than 5 acres each. So that's a lot of people involved in farming, and a huge percentage of farms controlled by these small-scale farmers. The big regulation change that many of these people are frustrated about is the fact that these new laws will allow farmers to bypass the government-regulated markets for trade and sell directly to private businesses, as well as permitting the stockpiling of crops. This might sound like sensible deregulation, and maybe it is. In fact, many economists back this move, seeing it as a modernising force for India's agricultural sector. They hope that by doing this, they can attract investors into the space and increase productivity overall. Productivity is an actual issue too, with farming only representing a small fraction of India's total GDP, despite the number of people working in the sector. Even the US seemingly supports these changes, with the State Department reporting that in general, the United States welcomes steps that would improve the efficiency of India's markets and attract greater private sector investment. This is actually a challenge that a lot of developing countries find themselves facing at some point or another. Because when a lot of people work in subsistence farming, there are major inefficiencies, as we've clearly demonstrated. So at some point, governments normally step in and shake things up in order to increase efficiency, profit, and output. This is always painful for the farmers caught in the middle, but from an economic perspective, there's a whole lot of wasted effort and labour being tied up in this kind of farming, which Modi and the government hope can be repurposed once the market becomes more efficient. Even if you agree with this economic argument, the real problem that India's run up against here is the way that Modi's government has attempted to make these changes, without gradual implementation, consultation with farmers, or reassurance from government, meaning that farmers are seriously worried about their future. They're worried that with these regulated markets being bypassed and new investors entering the space, that small businesses and farms will get crushed by big agriculture. They may appreciate that the current system's not totally efficient, but no amount of economic logic is going to convince them that their business being crushed is a sacrifice worth making. They're also concerned that this shift could eventually lead to the government implementing further changes, such as the removal of rules mandating minimum prices for crops, rules which protect many farmers. The government have insisted that they won't change minimum pricing, but given how these 3 laws were pushed through with no consultation, there's not a whole lot of spare trust floating around. And all of these changes are a serious worry for the economic well-being of millions of Indians. In fact, currently more than half of Indian farmers are in debt, and recent years have seen this figure rising. This is such a major issue that some 10 to 20,000 Indian farmers have died of suicide between 2018 and 19, really highlighting the hopelessness that many feel, something they fear is going to get worse. So, facing an already bleak future, farmers didn't take kindly to these new laws, which they saw as further jeopardizing their industry, their businesses, and their livelihood, fearful that their world could be suddenly swallowed up by major multinational corporations. So, in response, farmers started marching to protest these changes. Protesters headed to New Delhi, the country's capital, where police used tear gas and water cannons, as well as blocking roads and shutting down the internet to prevent them from entering the city. So millions of farmers essentially just set up camp surrounding the city. The police's efforts to keep protesters out didn't work forever though, with protesters making it to Red Fort, an iconic location in the city just a couple of weeks back, marking a symbolic win for the protesters before they were pushed back to the camps where they remain to this day. More interesting though than the exact geography of the protesters is what this means for Modi. Pushing through legislation like this is normally pretty easy for the Prime Minister. With control over the government, a weak opposition, as well as the media and judges broadly on his side, Modi is used to getting what he wants in situations like this, a balance which these protesters have fundamentally thrown off. Ultimately, much of this problem comes down to Modi's increasingly autocratic approach to governing. Like we said, this was always a kind of inevitable issue the country was going to face, and there's a clear economic case for what they're trying to do, whether you agree with that case or not. The issue, or at least one of them, is how Modi attempted to get these changes implemented, by ramming them through the country's parliament, in a similar manner to how he approached recent legislation relating to both citizenship and Kashmir. This is an approach that Modi's becoming all too familiar with in recent years, abandoning traditional politics just to force through whatever he wants. But now this methodology seems to have caused him a problem, with the people he's supposed to be representing standing up and protesting. It's certainly possible that if a different tack had been taken, a lot of these issues could have been mitigated. People would likely have still been angry, but the lack of assurances, implementation period, or consultation really did make things substantially worse. Which begs the question, will this incident and the protests surrounding it change Modi's approach to governing going forward? That's a doubly important question, because a lot of protesters taking part aren't actually farmers anymore, with other citizens joining their ranks to protest myriad other issues. This is clearly a growing movement, and fundamentally highlights a lot of the country's dissatisfaction with Modi and his government. So it's possible that this movement could mark a shift for the Prime Minister and the government as a whole. But the party continues to hold a tight grip on the media and their detractors, with an interesting battle currently playing out between the government and companies like Twitter. Modi might still have control and influence in the country, but these protests are a powerful sign. Now, those upset with all facets of Indian life have a movement they can get behind, and having this new space to protest Modi and his government has allowed a number of new issues to emerge for the government. Issues which may be tricky to suppress again, if and when these protests do die down. Earlier, I shared a quote from the US State Department supporting the reforms, but that's not all the US have had to say on the issue, with officials encouraging the government to open dialogue with the farmers and supporting the right to protest. Dialogue has been difficult though. Farming unions and the government have been at the negotiating table a number of times, but no one's been able to reach a deal just yet. The protesters may appear to have got a slight win in January, when the Supreme Court delayed the three bills' implementation for 18 months. But many believe that this actually helps Modi, with the pro-government courts giving the government an easy distraction and way out. Ultimately, India's farming industry does need changing. The sector is incredibly inefficient as it stands. Land is being overused and soil nutrients depleted. Farming practices such as crop burning damage the environment substantially, and almost 50% of produce ends up going to waste due to issues surrounding refrigeration. So before we even get to the economic arguments, reform is needed. The issue is that these changes were implemented pretty poorly, tainting the whole issue and making discussion about change much more difficult. That doesn't mean that India can avoid these problems though. Things might have been delayed for 18 months, but these challenges will persist, and so it seems will the protesters. What do you think though? Are the farmers right to be upset with the changes, or should they be forced to adapt as big agriculture enters and modernises the space? Also, do you think that the protesters have a chance of impacting the broader issue, fighting against an increasingly autocratic government? Or is Modi doing the right thing, trying to modernise and develop the country? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.